Cardiac output equations, we have stroke volume equals to end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So the end diastolic volume is the amount of the volume of blood that's already there in the ventricle after the full relaxation and filling phase. So it's basically at the end of diastole, while the end systolic volume is the volume of blood that is that is left there in the ventricle after its contraction and going through the systole, and that is just ejecting blood out of the heart. So yes, and systolic volume. So for the ejection fraction, it's the amount of blood that can actually go out of the heart in one heartbeat. So it equals the stroke volume over end diastolic volume. And the stroke volume by itself, we can use the upper hand equation, that is the end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume over the end diastolic volume. So ejection fraction is an index of ventricular contractility. Well, makes sense because it's the amount of blood that is coming out of the heart, so it can give us some idea about like what is the ventricular contractility, because it can be reduced in systolic heart failure if the heart is failing during a systole, but it's even usually normal in diastolic heart failure because ejection fraction goes in the systole, not in the diastole, so it's not going to be changed in diastolic heart failure. For the cardiac output, so the cardiac output is equals Q equals stroke volume by heart rate, and we have the Fick principle, which says that the cardiac output is just an equation of the rate of O2 consumption over arterial O2 content minus venous O2 content. So basically, like the amount of blood used by the body. So this is blood going to the tissues, O2 going to the tissues over here, and this is O2 returning from the tissues. So it's basically how much the tissue has used out of the oxygen. So in early stages of exercise, for example, let's say someone who's running, his cardiac output would be an increased heart rate and maintained by the increased heart rate and increased stroke volume. But by time, as he keeps running, then the cardiac output will be maintained only by the heart rate, by the increase in heart rate. But the stroke volume plateaus, it just loses its ups and downs and just goes into one plateau. But the heart rate is the one that is maintaining the cardiac outputs in the later stages of the exercise. So the diastole is shortened with heart rate, with increased heart rate, for example, in ventricular tachycardia, because in increased heart rate, that means the heart is pumping too fast, it's just beating too fast, so it doesn't have enough time between each another beat to fill. So it's just beat after beat, so it doesn't have enough time to fill, so that means reduced diastolic filling time, and also reduced stroke volume and reduced cardiac output. For the pulse pressure is basically systolic blood pressure minus diastolic blood pressure, and it's directly proportional to the stroke volume and inversely proportional to the arterial compliance. The increase in pulse pressure can be seen in hyperthyroidism, aortic regurgitation, aortic stiffening, and that also could be part of the isolated systolic hypertension in older adults. And also the pulse pressure can be increased in obstructive sleep apnea, where we can see an increased sympathetic tone, and also in anemia, exercise, and that is the transient form of exercise. But also it can go down and can decrease in aortic stenosis, in cardiogenic shock, in cardiac tamponade, and in advanced heart failure. So that's for the pulse pressure. For the mean arterial pressure, it's the mean arterial pressure is basically the amount of pressure in the systemic circulation all over the systems, because it's basically maintained by it equals to the cardiac output by the total peripheral resistance, and this total peripheral resistance mainly depends on arterioles, so it's the smaller arteries. These are the ones that are responsible for creating this total peripheral resistance, and it does have a major effect on the cardiac output and everything. So the main arterial pressure at resting heart rate without exercise, without doing any heart activity, equals to 2/3 of the diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 of the systolic blood pressure. It also equals, like another form of the equation is just the diastolic blood pressure plus third of the pulse pressure. So now we have the Starling curves. It's the force of contraction is proportional to the end diastolic length of cardiac muscle fiber. That is the preload. So basically, it's the how much the heart can pump, or actually how strong the heart can pump, is proportional to the length of the cardiac muscle fiber. That means how much stretch there was in the wall before the heart starts pumping. And what we have here is that graph, ventricular and diastolic volume preload. We have the ventricular and diastolic volume on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the stroke volume. So basically each one of those graphs just represents the relationship between the ventricular and diastolic volume and stroke volume. So what are the changes that happens to each one because the other one is changing. So for the normal rest, that is the black line, let's see the changes. It's if we increase the contractility for the catecholamines, for example, that these are positive inotropes like W-tiamine, milrinone, and milrinone. Yes, and digoxin. And there could be decreased contractility with loss of functional myocardium, like like part of the cardiac muscle is dying, so the cardiac muscle lose some of its ability to pump. That would lead to decreased contractility. And also beta blood